I will say that since the first of the year, Jim DeMint, my cherished colleague and friend in the U.S. Senate, and I have reintroduced the Broadcaster Freedom Act in the House and the Senate, and most recently, at the end of February, the Senate took up Senator DeMint's amendment on the D.C. voting legislation that would outlaw the Fairness Doctrine, and again, it passed 87-11. However, Senator Dick Durbin also won approval the same day by a vote of 57-41 for an alternative amendment to the bill that would order the Federal Communications Commission to encourage radio ownership diversity. Now, the D.C. voting legislation hasn't been signed into law, but as we all learned, and as I'm sure no doubt been discussed here, April 22nd, the Federal Communications Commission announced a Federal Advisory Committee on Diversity for Communications in the digital age. And while we assume best intentions, I must say I'm unimpressed by the diversity of the Federal Advisory Committee on Diversity. Let me say a couple of other factoids, and then I'd be happy to go to questions. Earlier in the month, we heard similar calls for the old Fairness Doctrine. Senator Debbie Stabenow, in a radio interview on the Bill Press show, ironically, said, "I think it's absolutely time to pass a standard." Now, whether it's called the Fairness Standard, whether it's called something else, I absolutely think it's time bringing accountability to the airwaves of America. And so I guess my role here, Tom, is number one, to say thanks to Judicial Watch for being on the ramparts again for freedom, but not to try and compete with the legal acumen of the people, the distinguished leaders on this panel, but to add in from the trenches along the Maginot Line of the First Amendment that this is real, and that I really do believe in my heart of hearts in a free and independent press. I don't think our founders put a free and independent press in the First Amendment because they got good press. I've read enough of American colonial history to know otherwise. I think our founders put the freedom of the press in the First Amendment because they understood that the only check on government power in real time is a free and independent press. Probably, I would argue that maybe the free and independent airwaves and the vigorous debate that happens on them every day in every jurisdiction of this country may be one of the richest legacies of the Reagan administration, because it has afforded Americans left, right, and center to have real-time information on what their government is doing and to be able to hold people accountable in government, not only in the ballot box but also at the town hall meeting and outside the grocery store. And we simply cannot stand idly by while that freedom is diminished. And so we're going to continue in the fight, but rest assured, Democratic leadership in the Congress is categorically opposed to bringing up the DeMint-Pence bill in the House or the Senate for a fair up or down vote. Jim's had some success on his amendment, but if the American people will rise up with one voice and demand an up or down vote on freedom, Broadcaster Freedom Act or any iteration thereof to battle this new form of regulation of the airwaves, I believe we'll pass it. Because every time freedom gets an up or down vote on the floor of the people's house, freedom always wins. So we ask you for your help. We covet your activism and your prayers. And with that, confident of that, I'm confident freedom will win again. So I am encouraged but not content, because we're getting mixed signals out of the administration. And frankly, we're trying to analyze and understand this diversity committee, because while I think we may have had some success in beating back a return of the traditional Fairness Doctrine, there's no doubt in my mind that there are forces marshaling on Capitol Hill under the rubric of diversity, encouraging diversity of ownership, diversity of content, that are prepared to bring a different form of legislation or to support the creation of new regulations at the FCC that might be rhetorically palpable to the American people, but they would amount to nothing more than a stealth version of the Fairness Doctrine. What we need the President to say, and again, I don't believe I recall the President ever being on the record saying he was opposed to the Fairness Doctrine. I've heard spokesmen say it, which I respect, but I think we need to say the President of the United States ought to seize some opportune moment to categorically reject any Federal Communications Commission regulation of content of the airwaves of America in the 21st century.
Well, of course, in theory, the Commission can reinstitute the Fairness Doctrine on its own. Have you received any intelligence, Dick and Jerry, from as to what the views of the new leadership that the President is putting forward, the FCC? I forget the incoming chairman's name.
His name is Janikowski, and no, I have no information on his specific views in this area. I don't think he's been heard to say.
We do know that the current acting chairman, Chairman Copps, is fully behind the efforts to increase diversity of ownership and increase the diversity of content that federal regulators would deem to be more appropriate. He wants to, for example, mandate a certain number of hours of local programming, as if local programming is to be favored over any other type of programming. Mind you, there's nothing in the Communications Act that says that broadcasters have to program locally. There's nothing certainly in the Constitution that says that, or indeed in the statute, the Communications Act. But think about this. Let's suppose that we do an ascertainment of our community and we say that teenage pregnancy is a controversial issue of public importance. Not controversial, just an issue of public importance. We saw just yesterday the number of births to unwed mothers is just skyrocketed. Let's suppose that that's an issue. Why is it any better that the broadcast station addresses that issue with programming on its local news or Oprah Winfrey that we buy from Chicago? Why is it any better? If you're addressing the issue of public importance, why does it matter? And the broadcaster is making that decision. I don't need, for WJLA or News Channel 8 or Politico or any of our websites, I don't need the government to tell me that that's a controversial issue that I'm going to address. But the Commission seems to suggest in this localism report that local programming is to be preferred with no statutory basis, no constitutional basis, and no regulatory basis.
Well, you know, I mean, to be frank, this localism effort is a product of the left. I mean, this is Acorn, Rainbow Push. They specialized in this, and they finally got the ear of the FCC and the staff there, or whoever's promoting this. So, I mean, I don't want to pretend, in my view, I don't want, from my perspective, I don't want to pretend there's any legitimate government interest here. I think this is a vehicle for ideological warfare in the media, but that's my view. But
that's been a very real concern, Tom, and let me, with apologies to my panelists and to the attendees, we have a vote imminent and about 20 minutes away by driving, but I think that's the concern, is the ability of organizations who have demonstrated a great capacity to mobilize, to be able to then utilize new arteries of input and ascertainment to affect programming. The reality is, in all of this, you sit there thinking, well, but I think until you push away from the table and say, well, why don't we have an ascertainment diversity committee for the local newspaper? And people would be horrified by that. Why would we do that? Good heavens, it's freedom of the press. I've authored legislation that I hope is signed into law this year that protects a reporter's right to keep sources confidential. And I believe that's about accountability as well. But I've looked some of my favorite liberal reporters right in the eye, and I've said to them, you know what? The editorial page is a part of the newspaper. And commentary on the radio is just as much enshrined and protected in the freedom of the press and the Constitution as any other aspect of the press. And we need to, you know, I think our challenge as Americans is to frame this debate in those terms. And the stakes, I think, are just that high. But we'll have to rely on experts like these two distinguished panelists and on Judicial Watch if we have in fact succeeded in stopping the Fairness Doctrine from rising from the grave, from a regulatory standpoint, we're going to need to be able to respond in a substantive way to some new iteration of it, because it really is all about freedom. But thank you for permitting me to be a part of this.
Please go and vote. Vote the right way, of course. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.